This is a truly evil Russian Christmas story, but it's not because of any bad spirits or entities. It's because of the vile parents and the things that they did to their son, and it's honestly sickening and disturbing. A testament to the fact that not every parent deserves to have their kids. Naturally, I contemplated whether or not I should even do this video. However, this is a reality that many individuals suffer through. Even if it is a moment itself in the past, the trauma from parental abuse, which comes in many forms, is beaten into our skin. And my channel is about going beyond. But in this case, it's about going beyond what I'm comfortable with. Because again, and I have to warn you, this is going to get extremely uncomfortable. Be advised. But my intent isn't to tear open old wounds, it's to provide a safe space for anybody who needs it, where if wanted, people can respectfully just pour out their hearts. No judgment, just listening with human compassion. So I will tell you the story of Evil Holiday, but afterwards I will explain what is going on with psychological lenses and draw theories to explain why the terrors in this horror game appear. If you are interested in video essays that combine psychology and story analysis, you're in the right place. But we can't say the same for little Georgie, as he shouldn't be here, and you're about to find out why. Fortunately, little Georgie only crashed the car a few several feet away from his childhood home, but he hasn't been here for 20 years. However, seeing as it is the holidays, his parents and little brother Shirley are expecting him. Then again, perhaps not, because the lights are off and the door is locked. So Georgie finds the key next to the door, then lets himself in. Only when he turns on the lights, he's immediately assaulted by the echoes of the house, where his mother chastises him for leaving the lights on.
Тупой мальчишка! Ты опять забыл выключить свет! Пока ты гулял и веселился, мы с твоим отцом становились бедняками!
But little Georgie, not directly acknowledging what he just heard, says that despite everything, we need to get the vibes right. So, he turns on the holiday music and then he finds a letter from his mother where she explains that they went to get groceries, but also tells Georgie to put the groceries away, as well as put up Christmas decorations and place the chicken in the oven. Accordingly, on his way up to grab the decor, little Georgie says that his mom always locked the doors inside the house whenever she would go out. Ascending the stairs to grab the lights, Georgie sees his childhood teddy bear on display, but it's next to an axe, and he says that his parents forbade him from playing with it. However, when Georgie is about to go downstairs, he hears the terrorizing voice of his father, threatening him with violence, saying he would whip him if he touched his papers again. But, still undeterred, Georgie continues to put up the lights, the tree, and put the chicken in the oven before deciding to go upstairs to get some rest. But he's confused when he finds the key to the room on the floor. Opening the door to the computer room, another memory comes crashing down on him, one where his mother is shouting at him for locking the door but also stating that she knows what he's doing behind the door. Seemingly affected by this memory, he says that after Christmas, he will never come back. But that's when things start to take a horrific turn, because there is something standing outside the house, through the window, staring right at little Georgie. The figure is a dark, abnormal, humanoid silhouette with elongated limbs, eerie and unsettling. But Georgie is fine confronting it, and yet, when he goes outside, it's nowhere to be seen. But he thinks it's just the kids playing pranks, so he inspects the yard, but finds nothing. As a result, he goes back inside to take a nap. However, his sleep is disturbed by the oven alarm being set off. Therefore, Georgie grabs the burned chicken from the oven and tries to throw it outside, but somebody's locked the doors. Consequently, he has to slip out the back to chuck the chicken. But when he does...
Эй, малыш Джорджи, я здесь. Иди скорее сюда. С Рождеством, сынок. С Рождеством, сынок. С Рождеством, сынок. С Рождеством, сынок. С Рождеством, сынок.
Now panicking, Georgie wants to barricade himself inside the house, but as he's about to go in, he finds his dad's camera on the porch. So, taking it with him, he grabs some nails and boards from up in the attic and starts to barricade himself in, but the light shut off. But what we saw was a heavy-set figure with a sinister grin, intense eyes, and it exuded an unsettling, menacing presence. However, Georgie would press on, turning this into Outlast, using the camera to see, but what he sees is demonic. Upside-down crosses and tombstones, but also that the back door is now a brick wall. Therefore, the only way to go is upstairs, but when he gets up there, he starts to hear a baby crying. This leads Georgie to finding the baby, but he immediately goes to grab his axe. However...
Какой ужас! Нужно избавиться от этого ублюдка. На чердаке должен быть топор.
Strangely, when he comes back, he hears his mom's voice saying to cut the umbilical cord. In turn, when Georgie hears this, the crying ceases and turns to laughter. Despite this, it doesn't stop Georgie from dropping the axe a couple times until the baby stops making any sound. Then we hear dialogue asking what happened to baby Clark. Just then, Georgie begins to hear a demon praying, followed immediately by his mother urging him to cuddle with her.
Иди скорее к своей мамочке. Мамочка приласкает тебя, как в детстве. Тебе же нравилось?
Как мамочка заботилась о тебе.
So, Georgie believed that since his childhood, his parents were possessed by demons. But it's this flashback that shows when Georgie would come to this revelation. So one day, his mom wanted to teach him a lesson, whereby convincing herself that her child would never be able to learn any other way, would punish him by calling him a name, then proceeding to beat him until he would bleed.
Мне кажется, его нужно как следует наказать. По-другому этот засранец ничему не научится.
Иди сюда, малыш Джорджи. Мы просто поговорим с тобой.
Нет, нет, мамочка, пожалуйста, нет! Мне больно, мамочка, прекрати!
Хватит, Линда, у него пошла кровь. Соседи начнут задавать вопросы.
Now, Georgie's father would step in to try and stop his mom, but only because he was concerned that the neighbors would start asking questions. In response, his mom would only call Georgie's dad a wimp, as she would continue to abuse her son, using the excuse that she was teaching him to be strong and not a sissy like his father.
Не будь таким слабаком, Стив! Или ты хочешь, чтобы твой сын вырос сыкливой девчонкой, как и его отец?
Мамочка, ради бога, остановись! Я буду хорошим, только перестань делать мне больно! Ради бога!
Бога не существует, идиот! Разве он допустил бы что-то подобное?
But her sweet, disturbed little boy would beg her to stop in God's name, saying, "No, mommy, don't hit me again! Don't hit me again! I'll be a good boy, I promise, for God's sake!" But his mom would just call him an idiot for believing that there was a God. Because if God was real, would he really be allowing a mother to abuse her own child? So something clicked in Georgie. He took this as a definitive indicator that his parents were truly possessed by demons. Because how else could his very own parents, the first humans from whom he would learn the world, the ones who were supposed to show him love and patience, how could they be so cruel? Therefore, Georgie had to perform an exorcism. That being the case, finding a letter addressed by his father to Georgie, he would have to get the holy water and bless each room in the house. But when he got to the attic, he would see his parents up there with him. So he would begin praying to God, but this time, they weren't leaving, only getting closer and closer behind him until they were gone. But as he would approach his stuffed bear, his mother would jump at him again. However, he would carry on, grabbing knives and pressing them into his parents' bodies, until he would hear the words thanking him for exorcising the demons out of their bodies. And as he sees their covered bodies on the ground, his parents say that they have a gift for him. So he goes downstairs to retrieve it from the Christmas tree, but it's a cassette tape. By the way, who here is old enough to remember these? So playing the tape reveals that it's a video message to Georgie from his father. In it, he says that if he's listening to this, that means he's come back from therapy and is healed, continuing to admit that they were terrible parents to Georgie in every way possible, and acknowledging that he takes full responsibility for it. He explains further that when his little brother Clark was born, they all of a sudden had an awakening, so they become the loving parents that Georgie never got to have. But Georgie suffered for years, and it seemed like he was having some trouble in living with these changes, dealing with these changes. Consequently, there would be no turning back, now that they've woken up the demon in him. His parents changed, but he didn't. He was so down with the sickness, as his parents would open up their hate and let it flow into him. He was still the same eviscerated and mangled boy his parents left him as. His father admitted that Georgie's sanity was destroyed, but that they still didn't pay attention to him. Madness was the gift that had been given to him. So one day, while his parents were away, leaving Georgie and his little brother Clark home alone, Clark was crying. So grabbing the axe from the attic, Georgie would deal with it the way that he was taught, with brutality. His father, shattered, wondering but knowing exactly how and why, would cry out because of this. Their loved son, murdered by their unloved son, who would be leaving to be sent to the psych hospital. His parents would be waiting for him to return, lovingly, ready to welcome him back, asking Georgie for forgiveness and love, but what they weren't expecting was that before getting picked up to go to the psychiatric hospital, Georgie would be coming to them very soon to give them both the same love that they gave him.
Джорджи, что ты делаешь? Нет, сынок, не надо! Прошу, остановись! Нет!
Стив, Джорджи, что это за шум? О боже, прости нас! Нет, малыш Джорджи, нет!
20 years later, Georgie would be waiting in the corner of his room as his orderly would drunkenly stumble in, dropping a fork on the floor, wondering how Georgie got the name Little Georgie, not knowing that his parents gave it to him to mock him and keep him mentally little and inferior. But Georgie, silently closing the door, then picking up the fork, would kill the orderly, then proceed to give him the halo treatment, before grabbing the orderly's keys, escaping the hospital, taking his car, and driving home for the holidays. Taking in a deep breath, opening his eyes as if he woke from a 2-decade slumber, Georgie would look around his now dilapidated home to see that his family was not there. Even as little Georgie would call out for them like a little boy, there would be no family for him in this house. Everything has faded and fallen apart as Georgie goes outside to where the police sirens are closing in. But what's going on here? We know that the story loops back to the beginning as we see that car crash take place after Georgie kills the orderly and comes home. Georgie's been in the psychiatric hospital for 20 years, isolated from the world after the horrors he endured and inflicted as a child. But when he finally does return to his childhood home, everything feels wrong. The echoes of his past are still there, fragmented and elusive like a puzzle, as though his mind has hidden them away. So what's really happening to Georgie's memory? The truth is, Georgie's memories aren't gone. They've been repressed, a phenomenon known as dissociative amnesia. This condition often arises in response to severe trauma, as the brain shields itself by blocking access to distressing memories. But these memories don't vanish. They remain stored, waiting for a trigger to resurface them. Georgie's return to his childhood home acts as that trigger, reopening doors in his mind he had unconsciously sealed for decades. So, as he moves through the house, these repressed memories begin to seep back in, creating a disorienting clash between the past and the present. However, it wasn't just the trauma that caused Georgie to forget. 20 years in a psychiatric institution left its own mark. Long-term institutionalization often leads to cognitive dulling, where the monotony of routine and lack of stimulation impair memory and self-awareness. Add to the potential effects of psychiatric medications, which may have suppressed emotional processing and memory retrieval, and Georgie's disconnect becomes even more pronounced. So now that he's back in an environment steeped in profound emotional significance, his mind is jolted, struggling to reconcile these suppressed memories with his current reality. Walking through his childhood home should have brought clarity, but instead, it only deepened his confusion. This is because the house is filled with trauma-related triggers, objects, sounds, and spaces tied to emotionally charged memories. And yet, these aren't simple recollections. They're fragmented and distorted, consistent with the effects of PTSD, which often causes memory fragmentation where the brain stores traumatic events in a disorganized way, making them resurface in chaotic pieces rather than coherent narratives. And so, as Georgie encounters these triggers, his mind forces him to confront a history he spent 2 decades trying to forget, one fragment at a time. But what specifically about the abuse caused all this? Well, let's dive into that. Georgie's parents yelled at him constantly, using vicious names to belittle and control him. This wasn't just a momentary loss of temper, it was a systematic way to tear him down. But why do some parents resort to yelling and name-calling? And what does it do to a child's mind? So let's look at the research and psychoanalyze this behavior. When parents yell or call their kids names, they engage in emotional abuse, a form of verbal aggression that can be as damaging as physical abuse. Unlike physical scars, the wounds caused by words are internal and often go unnoticed. Research found that verbal abuse from parents leads to literal changes in brain structures, specifically affecting areas related to emotional regulation and self-esteem. So the insults and the yelling that many of us suffered from as children back then and now, including what Georgie endured, likely planted seeds of worthlessness that grew into the self-loathing that he carries into adulthood. Parents who resort to yelling and name-calling often do so out of frustration or a desire for control. A study by Simons and Johnson substantiate that verbally aggressive parents are often coping with their own unresolved anger or powerlessness that they experienced when they were kids, projecting their emotions onto their own children. This behavior teaches children, like Georgie, to associate authority with fear, leading to lifelong struggles with trust and autonomy. But yelling and name-calling doesn't just hurt emotionally, they physically impact the brain. Chronic exposure to verbal abuse raises stress hormones like cortisol, disrupting pathways involved in learning, memory, and emotional regulation. In a study done by Hart and Rubia, they showed that there were actual structural brain differences in the children who were subjected to high levels of verbal aggression versus the ones who weren't. Over time, these parents' behaviors distort a child's self-image, embedding negative perceptions that shape their identity in destructive ways. But this pattern often stems from learned behaviors. The ACE study showed that abusive parenting styles are frequently passed from one generation to the next. Instead of breaking the cycle, parents project their own unresolved trauma onto their children. For you watching this, your parents' parenting styles are likely a reflection of how your grandparents raised your mom and dad. Georgie's parents likely treated him the way that they were once treated, perpetuating a cycle of abuse that eventually broke him. However, this psychological damage can even come from something as small as denying your child toys. Like when Georgie explains in the beginning how his parents forbade him from playing with the bear. Being denied access to toys deprived Georgie of critical tools for emotional, cognitive, and social development. Toys are not merely objects of entertainment. They serve as essential instruments for creativity, problem-solving, and emotional expression, especially for growing kids. Plus, who wants to be bored? Without toys, Georgie was unable to use play as a way to process his feelings or escape the stress of his environment. This deprivation likely stunted his imaginative abilities and left him without healthy outlets to explore his emotions. Additionally, the absence of toys would have isolated him further, as he lacked the means to engage in peer interactions or solo play, which might have fostered a sense of connection and self-soothing. But his mother likely also would lock him in his room, reinforcing a profound sense of helplessness and fear. This act of physical isolation went beyond neglect, teaching him that his autonomy and safety were entirely at the mercy of others. Over time, this treatment also likely led to learned helplessness, where Georgie internalized the belief that no effort on his part could change his circumstances. Being confined in a space meant to be a sanctuary also instilled fear and anxiety, as Georgie may have come to associate isolation with punishment. The lack of comfort or reassurance during these periods would have further disrupted his ability to regulate his emotions, fostering a sense of abandonment and distrust. But even then, when locked behind closed doors, he would be admonished by his mother for doing things that is normal for kids who are growing, entering their teens, to be doing. The denial of privacy, especially regarding Georgie's natural curiosity about his body and sexuality, caused profound feelings of shame and confusion. His mother's acknowledgement and public embarrassment of these behaviors violated his personal boundaries, stripping him of his autonomy and sense of security. This invasive behavior likely taught Georgie that his body was not his own, and that natural developmental exploration was something to be ashamed of. Such experiences can distort an individual's understanding of intimacy and consent, leaving lasting damage to their sense of self-worth and personal identity. Let me tell you, when it comes to sex, growing individuals should always be granted their privacy to explore, as long as it's in private and by themselves. And even if a parent does know what they're doing, leave them alone. Don't shame them. Don't let them think that their privacy is being invaded. But even this isn't the most disturbing thing that happens to Georgie. He was sexually exploited by his mother, as when inferred during the memory of his mom encouraging him to open up the door so that they could play their favorite game, and even when she told him that she wanted to cuddle him. This is sick. This is sick, messed up on so many levels. No child, no individual, but especially child, should ever have to even come close to this type of experience. The instance where Georgie's mother exploited him using manipulative language like "our favorite game" and cuddle like when you were a baby profoundly violated his sense of trust and autonomy. As a parent, his mother should have been a source of safety. But this betrayal left Georgie with a distorted understanding of relationships and attachment. He likely developed a disorganized attachment style, marked by confusion and fear in close relationships. With this unfortunate event, in order to endure the overwhelming betrayal, Georgie may have relied on dissociation, mentally detaching himself from the experience to protect himself. This psychological defense explains his later habit of talking to himself as if he were another person, reflecting Georgie's fractured mind. When individuals experience violations of their bodily autonomy, the psychological impacts can persist and oftentimes do into adulthood. Always tell somebody, call the cops, do not accept this ever. Survivors often face emotional dysregulation marked by heightened levels of anxiety, depression, and symptoms of PTSD. Feelings of shame and guilt are common, as survivors sometimes internalize the blame for what had happened, further eroding their own sense of self-worth. Many also struggle with interpersonal relationships, finding it hopelessly difficult to trust others or set healthy boundaries. Dissociation, like what Georgie experienced, is a frequent coping mechanism, leading to memory gaps or feelings of detachment from reality. But just like in real life, sadly, it doesn't end here. The consistent beatdowns Georgie endured from his parents was not just a punishment, but a form of control and dehumanization. Physical violence sends a clear and devastating message to a child that they are powerless and that their value is tied to their obedience. I'll say that again. Many parents teach their kids that their value is based on how obedient they are. Over time, this abuse likely caused Georgie to internalize feelings of worthlessness and fear, believing that he deserved the punishment. Repeated physical harm also disrupts a child's ability to regulate emotions, as the brain becomes hyper-focused on survival rather than emotional development. This constant state of vigilance, which a child should not have to stay in, would leave Georgie unable to develop a sense of safety or stability, both internally and externally. Imagine being afraid whenever you hear your dad drive up to your house. The fear, the heart palpitations in your chest as he opens the door and you hear his footsteps, not sure what kind of day he had at work and whether or not you did or didn't do something. A child who has to live through that every single day of their life. There's also this scene in the attic when Georgie hears a memory of his father telling him that he would whip him for touching his papers again. The frequent threats of physical harm created a pervasive sense of fear that lingered even when the abuse wasn't actively occurring. Threats are a form of psychological abuse that reinforces an individual's dependence on their abuser and establishes an environment where they can never fully feel safe. For Georgie, these threats likely heightened his anxiety and contributed to his eventual behaviors, such as barricading himself inside rooms or inside the house just to feel safe. But the anticipation of violence can be as damaging as the violence itself, as it conditions a child to expect harm at any moment, further damaging their sense of trust and emotional stability. We see examples of this when Georgie hears his dad telling him, "Come here. We just want to talk to you," when Georgie is about to be punished by his mom.
Иди сюда, малыш Джорджи. Мы просто поговорим с тобой.
Нет, нет, мамочка, пожалуйста, нет!
And we can also see that this perseverates into his adulthood as he sees his dad outside after throwing away the chicken, walking by again telling him, "Come here, little Georgie." The extreme nature of physical violence that Georgie experienced, such as being beaten until he bled, escalates the impact of abuse from psychological damage to physical trauma. This level of brutality not only reinforced his feelings of worthlessness, but also normalized violence as a solution to conflict. Children exposed to such severe encounters often struggle with recognizing boundaries and may replicate these behaviors later in life. For Georgie, this may have laid the groundwork for his belief that violence is an acceptable response to frustration or perceived threats, contributing to his eventual violent actions. The dynamics between Georgie's parents added another layer of psychological manipulation to his experience. His mother's dismissal of her husband as a wimp rationalized her violent behavior and sent a clear message to Georgie. Physical dominance equals strength. And that's right, and that's okay. And that's what you should want. This toxic framing likely left Georgie with a warped understanding of masculinity and reinforced the idea that compassion or restraint is equivalent to weakness. Restraint and compassion is not equivalent to weakness. I won't even get into the dynamics at play when one parent explicitly looks down on their partner and how it shapes the way that a kid interacts with that parent too, or even learns how to treat their own partners when they eventually get one. But over time, this belief may have influenced Georgie's behavior as he internalized his mother's justification for violence as a necessary part of life. When Georgie invoked God's name, his mother mocked him and declared that there was no God, dismissing his plea and any hope that she might stop hitting him. This denial, paired with her cruelty, reinforced Georgie's belief that she was inhuman or possessed, magnifying the emotional weight of her abuse and deepening his sense of alienation and despair. Georgie's belief that his parents were possessed by demons reflect his attempt to rationalize their inhuman cruelty. For a child, the idea that their caregivers are fundamentally evil or possessed can feel more manageable than accepting that their suffering is a result of deliberate human choices. This belief also served as a psychological defense mechanism, allowing Georgie to separate the parents he depended on for survival from their abusive actions. By attributing their behavior to external forces, he avoided confronting the full weight of their betrayal. This coping mechanism became deeply ingrained, shaping his worldview and guiding his later actions. Barricading himself inside his room was Georgie's way of creating a sense of safety in an environment where he constantly felt threatened. This behavior reflects the trauma response of hypervigilance. Georgie anticipated danger at every single second and sought to protect himself physically when emotional safety was not there, unattainable, not there for him. As he grew older, these actions likely became symbolic of his overall isolation, both physically and emotionally. And we see that here in the game. When he feels threatened and he's not sure what's going on, his first initial reaction is to grab a hammer, boards, and nails and nail the door shut. The act of building physical barriers mirrors his psychological barriers, where he shuts others out and retreats into his internal world to escape his pain and fear. But Georgie would begin talking to himself soon, as if he were another person.
Ты что, действительно убьешь ни в чем не повинного младенца? Да ты спятил, малыш Джорджи.
This represents a clear manifestation of dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism triggered by extremely severe trauma. But there are also instances where the voice he adopts often mimics his father's, suggesting that Georgie internalized his father's abuse and now perpetuates it against himself. This internalized voice echoes the same belittling, demeaning language his parents used, showing how their cruelty became embedded in his psyche. Throughout the game, players hear this voice as if it's coming from his parents, but the truth is, that's Georgie speaking in their tone. and this reveals the extent of his psychological fracturing. By dissociating, Georgie distances himself from his pain but also reinforces his identity as a victim trapped in a cycle of abuse. Through the relentless violence he endured, Georgie internalized the belief that violence in its many forms is an effective way to assert control or solve problems. Now, I've always said that violence is never the answer, but it is an answer, and it's usually a very effective one. But that second part is a mentality that many people who learned violent tendencies carry with them into adulthood, solving problems with their fists, because they learned it from somebody else and they saw that it worked. For Georgie, his parents' actions taught him that power comes from inflicting harm, and he replicated this behavior when dealing with frustration or conflict. This belief reaches its tragic peak when Georgie applies what his parents taught him and kills his younger brother, Clark, as a way to silence his crying. Georgie's violent outburst was not just an isolated incident, but the inevitable result of a childhood where brutality was normalized and compassion was dismissed as weakness. Not to mention, he also killed the orderly without a second thought. The murder of his family is the culmination of everything Georgie learned from his parents. Clark's crying, a natural and innocent act, triggered Georgie's deeply ingrained lessons about power, control, and the role of violence in maintaining order. Killing Clark reflects not only the impact of Georgie's upbringing, but also the devastating consequences of a child absorbing and enacting the abusive patterns they were subjected to. This act shatters Georgie's remaining connection to humanity and cemented his trajectory toward emotional isolation and psychological disintegration. Something else to note, especially if you have siblings yourself, is that firstborn children often face higher expectations, stricter parenting, and greater responsibility as their parents navigate raising a child for the first time. This can lead to anxiety, perfectionism, or feelings of pressure. Let me know if you're an older sibling and this is you. They also experience a shift in attention when younger siblings are born, which can create feelings of competition or rejection. In contrast, younger siblings benefit from more relaxed parenting, a less pressurized environment, and never having been the sole focus of their parents, which often makes them more adaptable and socially skilled. While these patterns are common, individual experiences vary based on family dynamics and temperament, but currently it's the holidays and I don't want to leave you on a bad note. After all, this is just a game that I'm talking about, but the concepts do come from somewhere steeped in reality. My goal on this channel isn't just to entertain, but to educate and shed light on situations however best I can. Even if I'm not the best at doing it, I'm trying. No matter how dark a story may seem, it's important to remember that healing is always possible. If you or someone you know has faced hardship, there's strength in reaching out, sharing your story, finding support. We all deserve compassion, love, and a chance to rebuild. Love your kids, love your wife. I love my wife. And if you want to see another story about the harmful effects of intergenerational trauma, click this video. Thank you.